present our speaker for the afternoon. Patrick Harshbarger, an historian and archaeologist at Hunter Research Incorporated. Patrick has worked with Hunter Research for 12 years and has over 30 years of experience in cultural resource management. Now, according to Richard Hunter, he's a wonderful colleague and much cherished friend and very modest about his accomplishments. Patrick is a national authority on historic bridges and has brought work into their firm from all over the country, currently juggling projects from as far afield as New Hampshire, Texas, and Hawaii. But while bridges are Patrick's passion, he's incredibly knowledgeable about all sorts of other historical, architectural, and archaeological topics, such as mills, farms, and all manners of industrial buildings and houses. For more than 20 years, he has edited the Society for Industrial Archaeology newsletter, a high-quality, internationally distributed publication. Patrick is especially expert in the preparation of National Register nominations, which these days require greater researching and writing skills and a wide range of knowledge of American history than ever before. Above all, Patrick has a superior mind and the soundest judgment of almost anyone that Richard knows. He should have been a lawyer, Richard says. And he writes with great fluency and precision, and it's a pleasure beyond measure to have worked closely with him for the past dozen years. Today, Patrick will talk to us about the Drake Farmstead, which is local to where we are all sitting right at this time. And without further ado and giving away too much, I will leave you to hear from Patrick. Thank you.
Thank you. No. Thank you, Jim. Well, I'm glad we had that little break so I can stop blushing. Thank you, Richard and Kathy. It's a real pleasure to be here this afternoon. This is my chance to have a very knowledgeable and appreciative audience to talk about the Drake Farmstead and a project that's been going on for close to 2 years. And I need to give a lot of credit where credit's due, in that it's the Watershed Institute and their foresight to apply for a New Jersey Historic Trust grant that has gotten this project underway, and that grant has supported our research and writing to prepare a National Register nomination for the Drake Farmstead Brookdale Farm. And as Kathy's introduction and Richard's comments led on, it's the National Register program was created in 1966. The New Jersey Register program, which is modeled on the national one, came a few years later in the early 1970s. And in the early days, nominations were 4 or 6 pages long, and they were accurate for the most part, but that there wasn't the level of scholarship and in-depth writing and research that's required today. The standards have grown over time, and it does take years usually to get a nomination through the whole process. And we're in a really good position today. The nomination has made its way through several revisions and has received the approval of the State Historic Preservation Office staff. And they are the first gatekeepers in this process, and usually the ones that are the most difficult to please. We are on November 17th presenting to the New Jersey State Review Board, which is a professional board of historians and archaeologists and preservationists. And they will offer their comments on the nomination. And we hope will be very agreeable to passing it on to the National Park Service in Washington, D.C., to the Keeper's Office, where it will then be listed on the National Register. So we're getting very, very close to the end of the road with this nomination. There's still a couple of gates to get through, and there'll probably be a few revisions, but hopefully minor at that point. And two, as you were handing out your awards today, it occurred to me just how much this process of getting Drake Farmstead on the nomination stands on the shoulders of the research and the scholarship that's come before it on Hopewell Township. And, today's standards for these nominations really make it hard to do them without that local history already in place. So Richard's book that he did with Rick Porter was a major resource for us in developing the nomination. I also should recognize David Blackwell, because we relied on his work quite a bit, particularly when it came to the family, the Drake family and their genealogy. Phil Hayden, who some of you may know, was someone else that we relied on his work on the historic architecture. So this is all really important to developing a successful nomination. I also should acknowledge that this isn't just my effort, it's really is the effort of our firm, Hunter Research, and Richard has played an important role in guiding the nomination, as well as a careful editing. And I should also acknowledge my coworker, Aaron Boyce, who did really most of the bulk of the original first draft research and a good deal of the writing of the first draft. And Aaron has left us for another job a year ago or so, which we were really proud of her, and it was a big advancement. So this nomination really shows the quality of her work, and it has made my job in terms of refining it and getting it through the SHPO a much easier effort. So to sort of lay out what I'm going to do, we're going to take a tour of the Drake Farmstead. When I was asked to give this talk, I said, well, we're going to be at the Drake Farmstead. I mean, the buildings here, the landscape here, they're the resources. They're the stars of the show, really, not me and not this nomination. So I wanted to show you the buildings and let you see them through my eyes, and have you ask me questions about them. Have me ask you questions, because you may know things about the landscape and the buildings that I don't know. But in order to do that, I said, why don't we spend 15 minutes or so at the beginning? I'll do some slides. And what I want to do with the slides is give you a basic chronology of the development of the farm, and also a basic geography of the farm, the site plan and how it's laid out. That'll get you oriented enough, if you don't know it already, to go out there on the landscape and look at it and take the tour with me. And I really appreciate that Jim has allowed us access to walk around the site, and hopefully he'll open a barn door and we can peek our heads in. He's nodding his head. Okay. So away we go. I hope away we go. Is that? Oh, there we are. So this is the chronology part of it. And, this farm was occupied by at least 6 generations of the Drake family. The original Drake in this area was a Benjamin Drake. He owned some of this property. He came here by way of Piscataway, part of the New England English Drakes who came this way. They came to Piscataway around 1700. He then ended up with some land over here. And his son, John the First, and Rachel Morgan Drake are believed to be the first of the Drakes to have occupied this farmstead, probably sometime in the second quarter of the 18th century. The exact date is not documented, but they were certainly here no later than 1749, when they were clearing their title with the Cox family. And then John's son, John Sr., and Jemima Johnson Drake lived here for a very long time, 1750 to 1817. John Sr. Died a little before 1817, but his wife lived on. And these resources in this photograph are really the ones that we can be certain were here during this period of time, the colonial and early federal period. The east wing of the farmhouse, a small barn, which was later converted into a cottage, and a portion of the big barn. Some of its framing likely dates to this period. It's an evolved farm. This farm 6 generations of families. The farming changed over time. It went from like a small mixed family farm to a bigger farm with mechanization, more grain, more livestock. Eventually, it transitioned into a dairy farm. And through each one of those transitions, the composition of the buildings evolves to support the agriculture, as well as the size of the family and the multi-generational structures of the households, which were different from time to time. What I call the Greek Revival period here from 1817 to 1850 was the era of Andrew and Hannah Blackwell Drake. And of course, the Blackwells being a very well-known family in the area, as well as the Drakes. They built the big farmhouse, the big part of the farmhouse. It's a big Greek Revival center hall house. It actually dates to before 1830, which makes it one of the oldest higher style Greek Revival houses in the area. They also enlarged the barn, and we can be pretty sure of that from the dating and the style of the buildings. And then in the Victorian period, the Drakes continued here. Noah and Wilson Bede were brothers. Noah was unmarried, and when he passed away, it went to his younger brother Wilson and Hannah Ann Hart Drake, and then eventually to their son Johnson and Elizabeth Sked Drake, who are the last of the Drakes to live here. This is the era when it really began to transition into a big dairy farm. The barn is enlarged, but in an interesting way, in that an old barn is coupled onto a newer barn. And then there's actually another dairy barn building that's not there anymore in silos, and they all start to date from this era. So the barn probably reached its appearance during this period. There's a really nice drive-through corn crib and wagon house, and this marvelous Victorian windmill for pumping water. After the Drakes sold the farm in 1908, it went through a period of transition where it was owned by a number of different individuals, most of whom leased the farm out to tenant farmers. And it by 1930, it ceased being primarily a dairy farm, and it becomes a country estate or a country retreat for the Schwabachers. And the Schwabachers continue to allow the farm to be farmed. They have a cottage. They have a farmer who lives here in the cottage, continues to operate the farm. But at the same time, they're coming here during holidays in the summer and spending time to get away from New York City. And these are interesting people. Wolf Schwabacher is an entertainment attorney in New York City. He represents a number of famous playwrights and a number of actors and actresses on Broadway. And he is particularly well known for defending some of these playwrights against obscenity charges that were brought against them for the language that was being used in their avant-garde plays. His wife is probably even better known, Ethel Schwabacher. She is a very well-known American artist, abstract expressionist period artist. Her works are in all the major museums. This one down in the lower right corner of the screen is called Sundays. And so you can see her work at the Met and the Smithsonian and other places. So these are, they own the farm for close to 20 years. And in fact, when Wolf bought the farm, he bought it half share with his brother, Herman. And in 1940, Herman sold his share to another couple, Muriel Gardner and Joseph Buttinger. And by this time, of course, the farm is being known as Brookdale Farm. It's no longer known as the Drake Farmstead. And Muriel in particular becomes very closely associated with the farm and begins to make it her permanent residence almost upon the time she arrives here in 1940. She loved the farm. And they actually don't change the farm very much. When we walk around the farm, you're going to see that they really didn't do many big additions. They didn't do big alterations, really. They added this little wing to the wagon house, which is a kind of a rec room, meeting room. But more importantly, in their lives, what Brookdale Farm represented to them was a retreat from a horrific trauma, is how I would characterize it. And Muriel was an heiress. She was the daughter of the marriage of two of Chicago's biggest meatpacking families. Her original name was Helen Morris, so the Morris Meatpacking Company of Chicago. Her mother was a Swift of the Swift Company. They were merged with the Armour Company to make the biggest meat trust of the early 20th century. When her father died in 1913, she inherited the equivalent of about $40 million in today's money. That was just her share of the family fortune. She early in life expressed a real empathy for people who were in trouble, for people who were poor. And she remembered a story of her Irish maid telling about the horrific journey across the Atlantic in steerage in an ocean liner. And it really touched her. And it almost set her on a path of basically, once she became old enough, she basically started to give away her money to causes that that she felt were just and appropriate and equitable. After she graduated from Wellesley College, she went to Europe, and she had a couple of unsuccessful marriages. But she, as a result of that, she found her way to Vienna, where she was trying to get an interview with Sigmund Freud to be treated, psychoanalyzed by the master. And he never psychoanalyzed her, but some of his colleagues did. And she became so taken with the practice that she decided to get her own medical degree in Vienna and began working towards a psychiatric degree there. This was in the late 20s and early 30s, and fascism was on the rise. And she found herself in the middle of the anti-fascist movement in Vienna as Austria fell to the Nazis. And she began to work undercover under a real code name named Mary to carry forged documents from Czechoslovakia to Austria to get the opposition out of the country safely if she could. She used her funds to rent numerous apartments, to buy a cottage in the Vienna woods. These were all like safe houses for the political opposition, who were mostly socialists and communists who represented left-leaning political groups. During that time, she met Joe Buttinger, who's shown here on the right, who was an activist in Austria, and they fell in love, and were there in Austria when the government fell in 1934 after the assassination of the prime minister. Her husband was being hunted. She was hiding him in an apartment. They eventually decided it was untenable to stay, and he got out of the country to France. She stayed a year or two longer to help others escape Austria, but eventually herself decided she had to leave, and she got to Paris, at which point they were married, but he was thrown into basically a refugee camp that was being run by the French, where they were imprisoning Austrians and Germans who were trying to escape their countries. So it's a very moving story, and she's credited with rescuing close to 2,000 individuals during this period, and after the time that she eventually escapes to the United States. So they literally got on the last ocean liner to leave Europe before the war was really full blown. The last civilian ocean liner, and it's called the USS Manhattan. It left in late 1939, and they made it back to the United States and rented an apartment in New York, and that's where they get in touch with the Schwabachers, and they move here a few months later. So one of the themes of this nomination, which has been a challenge actually to develop is this connection with Muriel and Joe Buttinger, and how this period of time that they were associated with the farm is important in representing particularly Muriel's contributions. Joe's contributions are also great, but he had other places in his life that maybe could equally represent his activities during this period, and that's a bit of a problematic argument for the National Register. But this was her permanent home, and when she got here in 1940, she continued to advocate for refugees. She wrote letters, she sent money, she used her influence with politicians, including connections with First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt and others in the State Department to get emergency visas. She bankrolled the founding of the International Rescue Committee, which worked as the largest non-secular refugee organization in the United States at that time. They rescued many people of different persuasions from Europe. Many of them were politicians, intellectuals, academics, artists who had all spoken out against fascism. They also rescued Jews from the Holocaust, but that wasn't their primary focus, as some of the Jewish rescue organizations were. So that's Muriel. She lived out her life here. She continued to advocate for refugees, spending millions of dollars, but very quietly. She sent care packages to Austria, where she was known as Auntie Muriel to hundreds and hundreds of people because of these packages that came in the depths of poverty and starvation to help feed them and clothe them. And her husband, Joe, who she supported very faithfully, went on to build his own career rescuing refugees from Hungary, from Vietnam. Particularly, he was known as one of the first advocates for the United States rescuing Southern Vietnamese from the collapse of Vietnam after the Civil War there, and is controversial because he did advocate for America's entry into that war, which began the Vietnam War. He later stepped back from that and thought that the United States had gone too far, but he was early on an expert in Vietnam. So I've already spoken more than I said I would, so I'm going to move right on to say that Muriel donated this land to the Watershed. Part of this building that we're in right now was her ranch house after 1971. She and Joe had trouble negotiating the stairs in the house, so they had a one-story ranch house built here that eventually morphed into the nature center. During this time, Muriel's quiet, undercover personality came out in the open in the late 70s and early 80s because Lillian Hellman wrote a memoir that was well known called Pentimento, where there's a story about someone named Julia that Lillian Hellman claimed was a real person that she had known in Europe and who had a life very much like Muriel's. It's widely believed that Lillian Hellman's Julia was fictitious and that Muriel was the actual inspiration for it, although Hellman would never have admitted to it. So the movie Julia, which came out in 1977 and featured Jane Fonda and Vanessa Redgrave, brought this story to light. Muriel sort of became known again as codename Mary, the real Julia. And if you want to see a documentary that's quite interesting, you can go to YouTube. It's there, The Real Julia, the Muriel Gardner story from 1987. It's about an hour long, and it's a good, well-spent hour. So now that's the chronology. This is the geography part, and we have some maps. We are basically buildings right there. The yellow dashed line is the nominated property to the New Jersey National Registers. We've included the open space around the farm. And the Boston River Farm building is there, right? we didn't nominate this building because it's changed so much, and its integrity, historic integrity. It doesn't really look anything like it did during Muriel's time here. This is a zoom into the farm complex, and just to get you oriented, it's laid out in a west to east pattern, and you have the farmhouse anchoring the west end, the big barn at the east end, and then a range of other outbuildings between them. And this is like very important to the argument made by the National Register nomination, because what we're saying is that it's a really excellent example of what we're calling a ranged linear plan farm. So one of the things you're overlooked in architecture and farms is like the layout's really important to the operation of the farm. And there are traditional layouts, and they vary with ethnic identity and cultural traditions and the kind of farming that's going on. This is kind of an English layout, and there are a couple of different variations on this. The top is a very common plan called a courtyard plan. The house is in front, the barn is behind, and there's a lane running along the side, and maybe some outbuildings in between, creating like a little courtyard behind the house. That's very common. And then you've got this other arrangement, which is a linear plan with the gables, ridges lined up on the buildings, with the house on one side and the barn to the other, usually a lane running between them. Now, what we have here at Drake Farmstead, and I want you to pay attention to while we're out there, is we have a ranged linear plan farm. In other words, you've stretched out the distance between the house and the barn, and you've begun to arrange your outbuildings between them. And the outbuildings are usually in a logical way, with those most associated with domestic activities closest to the house, and those associated with agricultural activities closest to the barn and livestock. And you'll see that when we get out there, that this is a sort of the arrangement. And there's usually a service lane running along in front of them, and then another lane out to the main road. Classic what you've got here. You don't get to experience this very often anywhere in this area anymore, because so many of the outbuildings are gone and the barns, or many of them are gone. You have the houses very often, but you don't as often have such a complete assemblage of outbuildings as you're going to see on our tour. A couple of floor plans here, and then we'll go on our walk. This is the floor plan of the house. And the important part here is that A is a big Greek revival block. It was built in 1830. It's a center hall all the way through the middle of the house, with an arrangement of 4 rooms around the center hall. And that plan is repeated on the second floor. It's attached to an even older wing, which we have labeled B here, and it's a hall and parlor plan. Originally 2 rooms. One of the rooms was later subdivided to create a kitchen space and a dining room. And it has a really nice Federal period arc in the parlor, which we think probably dates it to about 1780. But when we get out there, we'll talk more about the evolution of that building or that wing. But I think there's reason to believe that there's parts of it that are older than that it may incorporate some portion of the original first generation Drake farmhouse from sometime before 1750. Then there's a big porch off this end. That was added about 1940. And then this is my last slide. This is an elevation of the barn, the big barn complex. And Mills and Schnoring, architects out of Princeton, have been working with the Watershed to develop a preservation plan for the barn. And there's a big grant coming to undertake the preservation work. And we've been able to use their drawings with the nomination. But what I want you to kind of focus on here is that you've got this very long barn complex, and it's actually composed of 4 separate structures that have been pushed together. So we've got a small barn here, which has been converted into a farmer's cottage. That's at the west end Okay, the framing in there, it used to be like a very small hay barn or a cow barn or something like that. It was converted to a cottage in the 1930s. We've got this little linking shed here. It's just a little passageway that you can go between the cottage and the big barn. And then you've got the large barn here, the biggest section. That's from the 1830s. And it's got a stable at this end and a big threshing floor up at this end. And then at this end, you've got a dairy barn. We know it's a dairy barn because it's got a concrete floor and all the stanchions in it for the cows to come in and feed milk. But the framing is a lot older. It doesn't even look anything like something that should have been built at the beginning of the 20th century. It probably dates to about 1780, maybe even earlier. It might be the first barn here. We don't know for sure. We'd love to do some vendor chronology, see if we can date the wood. But this barn, we think, probably was located somewhere else on the property. And when they needed to move it, to expand this barn and to handle the dairying, they moved the frame and set it down at this end. We know for sure it's not the original barn. It wasn't originally there because when you go inside, you can see the large barn's exterior walls on the inside of that building. So there are a lot of clues. There's a lot of forensic evidence in these buildings for how they've evolved over time, but it's an evolved farm, right? So it's not surprising that things get moved around. Farmers are very frugal, and it's got a really interesting history. And it's a beautiful, beautiful barn. So with that, that's actually at the end of the lane. So that's the last building we'll take a look at when we walk out there. So let's walk.